Happy Sabbath, brethren, and welcome to this Sabbath service for the 23rd day of November 2013. It's the 20th day of the 9th month on God's holy sacred calendar, the Hebrew calendar. And that means, being the 20th day of the 9th month, we've got the rest of the 9th month, we've got all of the 10th month, all of the 11th month, and all of the 12th month before we get into the new year on the first of the month next year on God's holy calendar, on the sacred calendar, and then 14 days into the sacred calendar next year. That's 141 days away and some odd hours and some odd minutes until sunset, the evening of Passover, when we have the Passover foot washing service just after sunset. And I see that we got to make a little change on our website calendar page. We say services are the normal time. Actually, services for the Passover foot washing will be at 7:30 in your local time zone. We do it every hour on the hour and every time zone, so that if you want to watch along and see Mr. Herbert Armstrong as he conducted the last Passover service he conducted before he died, we've got that on recording. We use that for the Passover service here on cogtv.org. Well, I hope you had a good week. I know some of you need some prayer. I know Kathy Scritchfield would appreciate it if those of you who will really put your heart into the prayer will pray that God will help her in her seeking of an income. She's applying for several jobs, and I think there's one that she'd like to have. There's some questions that the employer is asking that are those funny kind of questions you've got to answer in a narrative form, and she'd appreciate some wisdom on how to answer that employer. You know, if Human Resources will tell you, sometimes you can call Human Resources and ask them, what is it you're looking for there? How should I answer this question? And sometimes there's somebody there that will just tell you exactly what they want to hear. So what you should do is make very careful note or record that just for yourself so you can play back every word they said and type it up, get it down exactly, and use what the employer tells you what they're looking for. Sometimes better than asking 50 million people what you should do, how to answer this employer. Ask the employer himself. And if he'll tell you, then you know what he's looking for and you know how to answer him. If he won't tell you, you know, well, you got a game-playing employer anyway, and maybe that's not the guy you want to work for. But if somebody there is kind enough to tell you and explain, and even they may even be impressed that you took the effort to ask them. They may say, now that person is smart. They called and asked what we mean by this question, and therefore they're likely to be a good employee for us, because if they don't understand what we want as they're working for us, they're likely to ask us. And what better employee is there than that, than one who will ask you, is this for sure what you want? Or would you tell me for exactly what you want? Anyway, those are my thoughts for that. Brethren, what I have for you today is something that we played for the last 2 weeks, and some of you may say, well, Stephen, why are you playing this again 3 weeks in a row? Well, it's kind of like when Mr. Armstrong used to answer people when they would ask, Mr. Armstrong, why did you give that 2-tree sermon again? You just gave that last week and the week before and the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 13 weeks before that. And Mr. Armstrong said, well, it's like that preacher that kept giving the same sermon, and when they asked him why you keep giving this same sermon, the preacher said, I'm going to keep giving this same sermon until you guys get it and start doing what I'm preaching about you should do. Or, you know, and Mr. Armstrong said, I'm going to keep delivering the 2 trees sermon until you get it. So apparently we weren't getting it, right away. So he kept giving it. Well, the sermon that I'm playing for you again is the one that Mr. Carlton Smith gave on April 19 in 1986. He gave it shortly before the Passover, and he said in the middle of his sermon, he said, brethren, if you're just now doing these things I'm telling you about in this sermon, you're too late to be doing it for Passover this year. He said, you should have been doing this all year long. And therefore, brethren, I'm playing this 141 days ahead of Passover. I played it the last couple of weeks. Plenty of time before Passover, way ahead of Passover, so you can be sure you're implementing that. We're implementing what he's saying we should do in this sermon, and he's hitting the nail right on the head. This is the best sermon I've personally heard since Mr. Armstrong died that anybody's given. That's including any that I've given. And brethren, it's he's got the best definition of grace I've ever heard anybody give, too. You'll hear that in this sermon. And what I'm going to do, we'll go ahead and play it. I'm going to go ahead and roll it, and later on I'll do one separately that we'll put in the archive without my introduction. But here with how to prepare ahead for Passover is Mr. Carlton Smith, who at the time was the minister in Santa Barbara, California. I believe he was. He was either that or he used to be the minister up there for many years, and he traveled up there this Sabbath and gave it, one or the other. And outstanding sermon from, again, April 19, 1986. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Carlton Smith.
The Passover, the most solemn occasion of the entire year, wherein the Apostle Paul specifically commands us to make a self-examination before participating in that most sacred occasion, taking the bread and the wine, to know why you're doing it and to know whether or not you're going to be able to do it in a worthy manner. Now, how do you undertake this examination? What is the standard of measure? What must you discover about yourself in order to be able to take the Passover worthily? Now, of course, worthily is the adverb there, meaning the manner of taking it, not meaning how you are, your condition necessarily. Although it does apply to that too, but it doesn't mean that you have to be worthy, understanding, of course, that none of us are really worthy. We're worthy of death, and therefore if we got what we deserved, if we got justice, that's exactly what we would get. And we'll always be worthy of death, so that when we receive salvation, we're going to have to acknowledge it as a gift from God as a result of His grace and His mercy. And that is precisely what God is teaching us at this time. And I think that's the big lesson, one of the big lessons He wants us to learn. That it isn't something that we're going to ever deserve, but it is a gift from God, a free gift. And then, of course, along with that will be a reward that you do earn or you do acquire as a result of your works. Now, what is the standard then? Is it a certain degree of perfection that we must attain to? Or is it being sinless or becoming sinless? Now, surprisingly, the answer to those two questions, that is, it might be a surprise to you, is a definite yes. We do and should have achieved a certain degree of perfection, and we also must stand before God sinless. Now, that's a big order. But how do we do that? In view of the fact that Paul said that he himself still sinned, and we know that we do. Now, of course, as I said, the answer to these two questions is yes. Yes, you must have achieved a measure of perfection, and yes, you must stand before God in a sinless state. Now, we all should understand, I think, quite logically, and see the sense of the yes answer to the first question, that we ought to be growing. We ought to be achieving a certain degree of perfection year by year. We certainly should have made some progress, in other words, over the year. But what about the sinless question? The one about being sinless. You're probably thinking about Romans 7:15, Galatians 5:17, a couple of scriptures or sets of scriptures I quoted over and over and over, wherein Paul was confessing that he didn't always do the things that he knew he ought to do, and he sometimes did things he knew that he ought not to do, that there was sin in him. As a matter of fact, let's turn to Romans, the 7th chapter. Continue on that thought in the 17th verse of Romans 7. Now then, it is no more I, Paul said, after he had just said the things I allow, I do not, and so on. It is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwells no good thing. That's in the flesh. Paul saw, he understood that. And I think, the very first step to growing and overcoming is seeing what Paul is talking about here, understanding this about the flesh. There's no good thing in it, for the will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not. And Christ said in Matthew 26:41, I believe it is, that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. For the good that I would, Paul says, continuing in verse 19, I do not. I don't always do it. Paul isn't meaning here, as we'll see from other scriptures, that he never ever did any good. But there were times when he wanted to do good, but he didn't do it. And when he wanted to avoid evil, but he didn't do it. He goes on to say, but the evil which I would not, that I do. Now, if I do that I would not, that I don't want to do, putting it in more modern language, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. Now, the Apostle Paul is speaking in present tense. It is no more I, but sin that dwelleth in me. Here was the great Apostle Paul many years after his conversion, after being knocked down by the strong light on the road to Damascus, saying that it is sin in me. I have sin in me yet. I find then a law even, a law, that when I would do good, evil is present with me. And that's saying basically the same thing that he said to the Galatians in the 5th chapter in the 17th verse, where he said the spirit strives against the flesh and the flesh against the spirit, so that you cannot do that which you would do, what you would like to do. He goes on to say, verse 22, for I delight in the law of God after the inward man, but I see another law in my members. It's actually a law. It's the law of sinful human nature, warring against the law of my mind. Again, the same thing that he's talking about, same thought that he expressed in Galatians 5:17. And bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. And then he cried out, O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? I thank God through Jesus Christ. So then with the mind I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin. Now, did that mean, again, that the Apostle Paul was just letting down and wallowing in sin? Well, of course not. Paul is just saying here, and he goes on to illustrate that in the 8th chapter, and I'll get to it a little bit later, that if the flesh dominates, then it'll just be sin all the way through. But in this Christian life, he is showing here in Galatians again that there is this struggle. There is that law still there. And we're having to struggle eternally against it. As long as we're in this flesh, we will have this struggle. It will never let up. That's why we're told in Revelation and other places, it's those who overcome and endure unto the end who are going to be saved. And if you ever think in this human flesh that you're going to come to that place to where it's going to be a snap for you, that's going to become easy sailing with no resistance whatsoever from human nature, no fight, you are misinformed. And you need to become unmisinformed, if I may use the expression. Or, in other words, informed properly. And that's what I hope to do this afternoon for you. To help you to see, help you to understand this. There's a lot of deep knowledge in the book of Romans, and I think a lot of people just simply skip over it because it's a little hazy, a little fuzzy, and difficult to understand. It takes a little plumbing of the depths of it, of what Paul is saying, and putting together other scriptures with it to see it, to understand it. Because we must understand this. And I don't know of a greater Passover book than the book of Romans, except maybe the book of Galatians. Well, the whole Bible for that matter, and in particular Paul here in what he is saying to the Romans. It is very apropos for this season. So Paul is not saying that he was just letting down and wallowing in sin, as I'll very clearly show you later on. No, Paul was fighting with all his might all the time, but in spite of it, that human nature was there, and at times, he just grew tired and weary, just like all of us do, and he let up on the pressure, and that, as I've explained it before, human nature like a strong spring that we're depressing as we put more of God's mind on it. We lighten up on it, and it just sort of comes right back up like a spring does. And then we have to catch ourselves and begin to pound on it again and pray more and study and receive more of the Spirit and mind of Christ to push it back down again and to hold it down. But it's there. It's always there, and it has an upward pressure. Or maybe